Welcome to DEscuissions, the podcast where we explore the intersections of education, technology, and innovation to spark ideas and conversations that drive meaningful change. I'm your host, Brad Dennison, an EdTech enthusiast who's always looking for new ways to rethink how we reach and teach and learn about the digital world. Today, we are diving into one of the more unexpected and groundbreaking educational movements happening right now, one that's not unfolding in classrooms, but on TikTok. What started as a simple misunderstanding has grown into a grassroots, community-driven learning ecosystem with educators creating full courses, students voluntarily doing homework, and an entire TikTok university emerging in real time. To explore the phenomenon, I am joined by Maddie Shellgren, Director of Global Outreach at the Online Learning Consortium, and she is an expert in online learning, community engagement, and educational innovation. Maddie has been closely following this movement and brings a deep understanding of how social media is reshaping access, equity, and the role of educators in digital spaces. It's not just a viral trend. It has the potential for implications for access, equity, and the way we think about learning. So let's dive in. Maddie, I know I said a whole lot there, but is there anything I missed that you'd like to add before we get started?
Apart from, I just excitingly had a recent job title change that isn't announced online yet. Director of Outreach and Development now. But other than that, no, happy to dive in and eager to talk about engagement and all things e-learning.
Oh, fantastic. So let's just get right to it. TikTok University, as we're calling it, it took off fast and completely outside of the traditional education system. What does that say about how students want to learn today? And what can higher ed take away from the way this movement fosters engagement and collaboration?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll actually start with a little bit of just about the movement.
Absolutely.
And because I think that for listeners who might not be following along with this, either on the platform, TikTok that is, or unfortunately, what I'm really excited about is this has garnered some national media attention at this point as well. So if you were to look up, for instance, TikTok University, or more importantly, Hillman Talk University, which is this specific movement that I wanted to talk about today, you'll actually see this in the news. There's a Rolling Stones, there's a New York Times article about it now, an ABC newscast that went out about it, which is, again, exciting in a lot of ways that it's getting some national attention. But yeah, what's exciting about this is, so Hillman Talk, and to get into the ecosystem a little bit, is very different than what is now actually coined and legitimately coined TikTok University. TikTok University is very much a creator's space. And so it's TikTok led and designed for creators to learn how to create. But that being the case, Hillman Talk, the name is inspired by Hillman College, which is based off of an HBCU that came out of a sitcom, A Different World. What's so cool about this story is that it was a professor, Dr. Leah Barlow. She is a liberal studies professor at North Carolina Ag and Technical State University. She posted online preparing for a genuine class she was teaching for that university. And as part of her approach, she was leveraging TikTok to increase access. So imagine you're this professor and you're posting this, hey, welcome to my intro to African American Studies class. And suddenly, not just your 30-something, I think she had like 35 or so students in her class, but hundreds and thousands of people on the internet are thinking, oh, thanks for welcoming me to your class. So yes, hey, I can't find the syllabus. They're in the discussion board space of TikTok, if you will, of actually responding to her intro, being very excited about the content. And suddenly she went from 30-something students to thousands. There were others in the community, largely the TikTok community, that jumped in here and genuinely assumed that this was a public class, right? That this is going to be taught on TikTok. And from there, right, people genuinely dove in a way that excites me a lot as an educator, is that folks seeing this as an opportunity. And now we have over 400 plus courses and instructors from different universities being willing to give their time to create free content in an app like TikTok to the masses on a range of topics. There's dance classes, there's accounting, there's philosophy, there's liberal studies, there's history, you name it. Undoubtedly, there is either a course on it or like you could propose it and a professor could pick it up. So yeah, just a bit of history in that regard is just an exciting movement just to start off with.
I like it in some ways, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, but it's like someone took the idea of what a MOOC was going to be 10 years ago,
Mm,
a massively online, learning class, and they've made it engaging and interesting to the right targeted demographic. And so that's been really fun.
yeah.
Um, we keep talking about TikTok, and I'm in Texas and in education because of Texas, we're not putting TikTok on our teachers' radars because they can't access it on campus, right? But there's always other platforms too. It could be YouTube Shorts. It could be something on Instagram. But before I go into the next question, I do like talking about all the different social media platforms that you mentioned. Dr. Barlow, and her personality on Instagram is wonderful. The
Mhm.
just sheer fact that she is like, yeah, girl is officially a professor at Hillman Talk University. She is talking to the younger demographic in their languages, and so that's been really enjoyable. But more importantly, this is a Black-led movement, and it's amplifying voices and content that are actively being restricted, erased, or banned in traditional education spaces. How does social media step in to preserve and elevate those perspectives? And what does that mean for the future of open education?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting to me in linking TikTok as a platform and other platforms, I think TikTok stands out in just its design from other things, even like YouTube Shorts, and the way that the algorithm is based and feeds information, as well as its micro learning in action. But as many of our listeners might be aware of, open education has been very slow to be taken up within formal, structured higher ed spaces. So when you look at the power of a social media platform like this, particularly for marginalized and historically oppressed communities and voices, it becomes even more important and significant that this is a free platform. It's widely accessible around the world. Not, of course, not every world where it can access it, but right now we're living in an unprecedented time where curriculum of all sorts, voices are getting banned, actively censored. And I think what makes TikTok, at least in my perspective, such a different space to see this type of activism work in action, which is really, I mean, this movement is also activism in action. In a time of civil unrest, it's a way to speak back, and a way to amplify, as you had mentioned, and lift up voices that are genuinely being banned and silenced. But TikTok is an interesting community because there's a lot of self accountability and a way to call out. So if you have a creator, for instance, that is caught for lying or caught for spreading misinformation, that is called out very actively and very publicly on the app. And creators are tagged. There's movements to, and sometimes this is for the worse right now. For instance, I know within the Hillman Talk community, a lot of creators are right now suspecting active shadow banning, which is where you have essentially false engagement and you drive up engagement in a way that marks or tags in the algorithm that, hey, this is fake information and this is a bot, and trying to get creators off of the platform. But nevertheless, so important because it's very public, right? And so when things are being censored on TikTok, the TikTok community is actively investigating that. I'm going to use that term investigating in a real way, right? Not joking. And that you'll see folks have receipts, folks from around the world saying, hey, this is what I see on my TikTok. What are you seeing? Right. So, whereas historically, I think certain communities, the Black community being one of them, has had to do a lot of work. The LGBTQ plus community as well, being another just historically marginalized community as well, but having to do a lot of work to essentially evidence this censorship, evidence this oppression. Now it's very public. It's very obvious. It's in our face, publicly around the world that this is happening at scale. So to get back, I think social media in general plays this, particularly platforms like TikTok, plays a really pivotal role in raising awareness in a way that has not been accessible to us historically, to that kind of action, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned, I mean, you take it back to a different world. You take that sitcom and what that was trying to communicate to us as Zennials. And there is always some sort of way to engage and share messaging and put different ideas out there. And this is just, to me, that natural evolution of what we saw as like mass media in the 80s and 90s, right?
Mhm.
But to back it to the social media bigger picture, with more educators turning to social media like TikTok, not just to share the knowledge, but to make a living. Should universities see this as a competition? We've always joked about, even YouTube University back in the day. But I figure there has to be a way to actually work with the new models of learning and to get those in our faculty's hands.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an interesting question, just broadly speaking, when we think about the future of higher ed, because right now we see, particularly with influences of capitalism, large shifts happening with over the last even couple decades within the higher ed space, being one example, right? We've gone from what is, I think, historically very much privileged, this idea of critical thinking. You go to school to learn, to be thinkers. Right now it's very market driven. Right. So it's skills based driven. We're going and we are, why do we go to school now? Right. Whenever I ask the students I coach, I'm a coach as well. It's because they want a job, right? They're not going to learn, or it's either that or their family told them they had to go to school. But by and large, right, we've been operating under this promise. And right now the market would tell us it's a false promise that higher ed gets us a job. But even still, right, we see, at least in my academic affiliations, a lot of pressure to prepare a skilled workforce. And so when we're looking at that shift, we also can look at recent data. For instance, I done some work on this for my dissertation, just looking at the overall impacts of educator professional development. And part of the research I found was the trend in industry to essentially move towards an undervaluing or a devaluing of a degree. That instead we look at things like LinkedIn credentials, other credentialing that you can get outside of higher ed space as evidence of the skills that are needed for the workforce. So higher ed, when you look at that much, those bigger trends happening right now of what is higher ed, what can they actually do right now to be competitive in today's market, when we see these trends moving towards and valuing of other spaces besides a degree, or those that qualify with a degree. And TikTok is one of those interesting spaces that ever since its onset, we've seen the TikTok community actively communicating in this space. And this is where I think for me, the idea of a TikTok university really came. Again, before TikTok utilized that for creator space. But from the onset, even in 2021, I had given this presentation for the conference that my organization runs about TikTok, to try to raise awareness for folks that, hey, learning is happening here. And we in higher ed need to not only look and understand that, but look at how it's happening so we can learn from it. Because you had community members looking at, for instance, learning about Excel and how to run, that pivot tables are no longer in, that there's bigger and better things beyond pivot tables in Excel. And people in the comments very actively saying, I don't know why I went to college. I learned everything I need to know here on TikTok. And that should have woken higher ed up, even in 2021, right? Once TikTok was over a year old, right, people were actively not just dancing on the platform, but genuinely teaching and learning on the platform. We should have in higher ed paid attention then. And so now, if you zoom forward to today, when you have something like Hillman Talk blowing up, I can actually see a future where that is where learning happens. And again, pairing that back to market trends, if higher ed doesn't shift and doesn't embrace this type of new technological space, we're going to be even further behind. And I say further behind because higher ed, of course, notoriously is slow to change and slow to adapt to where learning is actually happening in society.
100%. Here at the college, we are a minority serving institution. We know for the most part that not all of our students have internet at home. But a lot of them do have that cell phone in their pocket. And so learning to engage with them on their devices has been something I've been very proud of in my department. We're working within YouTube Shorts to create very simple instructional video contents for all of our students with technology. But I always, in the back of my mind, I have to remember, not all of them have that technology, because we can be in a bit of a technology desert here. Yep. How is that? I mean, aside from the obvious answer of just time and moving forward, but How is that something that you're taking into consideration, that not 100% equity of the technology?
Yeah, I mean, you get that with genuinely any technology and any device. Not everyone has access to a computer, nor the funds. Not everyone has, even in the United States, not everyone has access to the internet. And so for me, I think that's a growing challenge no matter what for us, regardless of the technology that we are and aren't embracing. And so I almost see it as, I don't want to have a non-answer for you. We need to solve that answer regardless, is what I'll say.
That's my favorite answer.
Yeah. And for me, a platform like TikTok is, when it first came out, and again, harkening back to that session I was talking to you about that I gave in 2021, the unsurprising answer or response was, and I don't want to sound contrite here, but was, oh, are you saying that we should all just move our classes on the TikTok? Right. It was that I've heard that so many times as someone who works in ed tech of like, oh, here's this new technology. It's just going to be a trend. We'll move through it. And by and large, right, we see that all the time in educational spaces where, yeah, this new thing comes out and it's all the rage and folks are moving to it. And we're not really critically thinking about the pedagogical value of it. We're just implementing it because it's the cool new thing. To me, however, TikTok, platforms like that, even YouTube is still, while it's different in design, it's still very popular. It's still highly utilized. I go there for tutorials on how to use my saws, for instance, whenever I get them from the store, because they don't come with a training manual. So guess what? I go to my YouTube and there it is, how to use my new miter saw.
I fixed the push mower. I might have had a few pieces left over, but it was working thanks to YouTube.
Right, exactly. So yeah, we need to, as a education, if we are serious about education for all, we need to solve the technology issue. We need to solve access and bandwidth issues, just in general. But I still look at, and I see, I'm that person that looks at TikTok, not in the, hey, we need to move there. I'm not arguing that higher education should move there, but I do think higher education needs to understand that learning is happening there, that learning will continue to happen there so long as the app exists. And that if we don't embrace it, if we don't make space for it, we're going to be isolating a large opportunity to connect with people where they're at, a large opportunity to miss a new and exciting model for community, genuinely community-led, community for responsive learning, an algorithm that drives learning to the learner and customized learning, right? My algorithm is set so that I see the things I want to see. That is not possible in higher ed right now. We don't leverage that kind of algorithm. And I always get excited about the potentials of what if we could. What if higher ed was genuinely personalized? We always talk about how that would be such a good model. What if we could get there and look at platforms like TikTok for inspiration, because that is what it's doing, right? It's driving content that people want to see.
Building the community is really key to the engagement here. And that's something we can learn from mass media and social media in general. I mean, if you take it all the way back to the emergence of broadcast radio in the United States, it was a few blocks of an area and a single individual was giving news that was relevant to a specific community. And so even at the beginning of communication and in mass media, that's what we were doing, building community. And so we have a lot that we can learn from existing models. It's just sometimes change is scary.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's also, not to get into the finances and the actual capitalist side of higher education and education at large, but I mean, that is real here. Higher education is a business, right? That whether or not all institutions can be marked as for profit or not, it's still, money is being exchanged, lots and lots of money. The cost of higher education is of course continuing to rise. And again, if we tie that back with the incentive of what we get on the back end once we graduate, if you're not guaranteed a degree, right, we also see a movement towards a disillusionment with higher education. Massive dropout rates since COVID. While those are continuing to slowly rise, they're not rising to the degree that they should be. And so TikTok, I pulled a quote for you for today, but I had referenced my dissertation. And so it was just for very brief. I know that today's talk isn't about that, but just for context, is that my dissertation really focuses on the relationship between asynchronous and synchronous models to support educator professional development, right? So when educators go for professional development, where do they go and what do they want? What are they looking for? And how are they talking about that ecosystem? And I actually talked to the folks about TikTok. This is, as I said, this is something I've been thinking about for a while, but I had said, hey, can you imagine, here they are describing this ideal asynchronous digital learning environment, right? And a lot of it is what TikTok already offers. And so I put, because I like to think about these things, like, okay, well, let's look at a platform like TikTok. Could you ever imagine educator professional development happening on that platform, where that is where that happens? And this one quote, I just pulled it because it really touches on the cost of it all. Mm. And one of my interviewees said, if higher education was free and it was based on how much you consume, and then we made money off of the consumption of it and how it was being consumed, I think our model would change quite a bit. And I think that, right, when you think that is what's happening on TikTok, right, is higher ed has the potential to not be even marginally competitive with a TikTok-based educational market. And if we want to frame it around the use of TikTok in that way, the professors that I had mentioned with Hillman Talk, for instance, with the following that they have, if they get in with a creator fund, they have the potential of making significantly more money teaching on TikTok than they ever do at their institutions. And the learners are getting that learning for free. They don't have to pay for it. So if nothing else, right, I think higher ed has a lot to learn for what the market of learning is right now, if that makes sense, right? What folks are looking for. One of the public responses that I found really interesting with respect to Hillman Talk was the open awareness around folks in the comments saying, wait, you're telling me I could have had open and free education this whole time? And it's something to think about, right? Is that, yeah, you know what? Perhaps we could have embraced things like open education and reduced the costs of higher education and thought about these new models. And again, I know it's not that simple, but there are models out there that the community at large, the public, is becoming more and more aware of. And so if higher ed, in my opinion, wants to exist in the future as a viable model, we're going to have to transform and have to look at the ways in which we can work with, not co-opt these spaces, but work with these spaces. And that could look like a lot of things. One idea, for instance, that I know that floats in my mind as of late is that if we really are working towards a skills-based future, why can't TikTok be where those skills are acquired, right? And so when we look at where we are justifying the notions of expertise, what qualifies information, these are qualified university professors. Hillman Talk, as an example, is, I think, a fascinating one because the community is self-assessing and self-organizing, right? So the professors who are teaching, right, there are folks, they hold certain expertise. And I think it's interesting that not just everyone is considered a professor for Hillman Talk, even though technically anyone can be an expert on, or self-professed expert on TikTok, right, and produce content. The community is recognizing, okay, well, what are your qualifications, right? Let me see your degrees. Let me see, I don't want to learn from just anyone. And I think that is a really healthy response to, I know one of the questions you had prepped was like, what does this mean for the notions of expertise and where information is coming from and how we learn and academic and educational freedom? We can already see the community is responsible enough and knowledgeable enough about how this system works to self-assess, right, and self-organize around that question.
Yep, you beat me to it. That is exactly right. The credibility, institutional trust, and educational freedom, I mean, they're all achievable there. It's just coming up with really, really good project management plans for your institutions.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. Well,
I like
yeah, well, and I think, and again, I think I had mentioned this at least to an extent before, and I'll just return to it now because it's become relevant again. But the TikTok, though, like lots of other social media based platforms, there's a lot of toxicity in the space, sure. But to me, I also see the fact, and I don't want to undermine that by any means. That's not a huge but. That's not me saying, hey, let's ignore all that negativity and that toxicity that happens on the platform, the misinformation that's being spread. But what I'm encouraged by is that whereas there's almost assumed trust within the higher ed space, right? Where learners, it's one way, right? The university has hired folks and we're trusting as learners that they are credible, right? That they are ethical, that they are following these practices. If you imagine what a system of quote checks and balances might look like for the learner, there isn't really. We just have to trust that the institution has hired credible, ethical folks to teach us, right? TikTok, however, and other social media platforms, it is community policed, if you will, community governed in that way. And this is where I had mentioned before, and I just think it's fundamentally cool. Like, in my opinion, I look at that, I'm like, why can't we do that in higher ed? Like, that is so fascinating to me. Because whereas in higher ed, most of us know that what students leave on end of the semester feedback, that doesn't really make a difference, right? That kind of feedback system is very static. It's doesn't give learners a voice to actually impact changes within a higher ed space or even a curricular space. On TikTok, however, if you get caught lying, if you get caught spreading misinformation, God help you, because the community is going to call you out. And you can genuinely get removed by the app. So whether or not that always happens, I think, that's where the conversation is what does that system look like? What does the algorithm look like? What's the mechanism look like? But there's far more voice, community-driven voice on that platform than there ever exists in higher ed right now. So I think it spins on its head and can teach higher ed a lot about what a learner body base, like the actual public body of learners, is seeking in terms of how we establish, how we assess things like credibility, and things like institutional trust. Because I would argue a lot of people actually don't trust higher ed institutions right now.
Unfortunately. And, we're running out of time here, but I do want to say I would love to have you back, because I would love to talk about what we could learn from social media and put into our LMSs, right? And learn how we can take the lessons from social media and improve engagement in our classes. So please, please, please do be willing to come back. But before we say goodbye, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I think that I'll say this is because I know when you and I originally met up and explored the idea of TikTok, one of the original things that you had potentially wanted to tie into was younger generations of learners.
Absolutely.
And not to have that be the center on how we end, because that can be, of course, a whole other conversation. And I will self-profess I'm not an expert at Gen Z or Gen Alpha learners. I'm happy to do research in that regard. But what I am as an educator is extremely open to meeting today's learners where they're at. And so for anyone that's listening, whether you are one of those Gen Z or Gen Alpha learners, or you are an educator of variety of roles, ID to an administrator to president, whoever might be listening, is that for me, that is where I come. Again, I'm not telling you to go and teach on TikTok, right? Or to learn on TikTok, but it's allowing yourself to observe the fact that is already happening, and it's happening in a massive global way. And I'm very much of the opinion, as an educational technologist, someone that really likes thinking about ed tech, and looking at the ways in which we engage across different technologies in our digital learning spaces, that TikTok is a space that we cannot ignore. It is a learning space where learning is happening, teaching and learning is happening. So yeah, and this is exciting. People should be on there at least observing. And again, I know TikTok is one of those spaces where you're either on it or you're not. It's been politicized, so I'm not encouraging you to get on the platform if you're not comfortable with it, but at least engage in the conversation, follow the news, see how folks are using it, because it is an extremely powerful tool. And to me, marks I talked about this with a colleague just yesterday, that what is happening in that space with respect to teaching and learning, and particularly when we look at Hillman Talk as an example, it's being referred to as an educational revolution. That to me is huge, that is how the community is seeing it. But even as someone that's invested in the work of online learning for my profession, this has been one of the most exciting potential digital transformations I've seen in the entirety of my career. Even with AI happening, this is different. This marks a potentially different, radically different future for what higher ed could look like as a fundamental model. So if that alone doesn't convince you to pay attention, I don't know what else will.
I'm here for it, Maddie. Thank you so much for this. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, DEscuissions, been chatting with Director of Outreach for Online Learning Consortium, Maddie Shellgren. Please come back on the show. I'm sure you and I can have endless conversations along these lines. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks to you as well, Brad.